I was 31 years old the night I stood in a rented ballroom in a dress I'd bought for someone else's wedding, watching the man who raised me thank 300 people for protecting every child in this town, while a folder that was about to end his evening sat closed in my attorney's hands, 8 feet to his left. But this story really starts 2 years before that ballroom, on a Tuesday morning when a certified letter arrived at my apartment with my son's name spelled wrong on the outside of the envelope. My name is Iris Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and for 9 years I've worked as a charge nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit at Fairhaven General, which means I have held other people's children while machines taught their hearts how to keep time. And in 9 years I have never once let my hands shake where a frightened parent could see them. My stepfather told me, over pot roast on a Sunday in March, that a boy needs the kind of stability a night shift mother simply can't provide. He said it the way you'd read out a weather advisory, calm, factual, already decided, before he'd finished chewing. I didn't put my fork down. I didn't raise my voice. I asked him to pass the rolls. What Vincent didn't know, what none of us at that table knew yet, was that 11 months earlier, my late husband had signed one piece of paper that made this entire conversation, and every conversation like it, legally beside the point. It was sitting in a drawer 40 minutes from that dinner table, and not one person eating pot roast that night had ever read it, including me. 6 weeks later, a certified letter would spell my son's name wrong on an envelope trying to take him from me. And on a Saturday night, 8 months after that, under a banner with my stepfather's own name printed correctly on it, in a room full of people he'd spent 30 years trying to impress, he was going to find out exactly what he'd been standing on the whole time. Nobody at that table saw it coming from quiet, agreeable Iris, the stepdaughter who always passed the rolls, who never once made a scene. Welcome back to Calm Stories, where the ones who kept the peace for everyone else finally tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a quiet kind of justice is your thing, settle in, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and hit subscribe so you don't miss exactly how this one ends. Let me back up. I grew up in Fairhaven, a town of about 40,000 people split, unofficially but very precisely, by the river that runs through the middle of it. On one side, the streets are named after trees, and the porches sag a little more every winter. On the other side, the streets are named after the families who built them, and the porches have names for their own landscapers. My father died when I was 9, an aneurysm, no warning, gone between one Tuesday and the next, and for 2 years it was just my mother, Sharon, and me, in a rented duplex on the tree-named side of that river. My mother working 2 jobs and flinching every time the phone rang because it was never good news anymore, only ever a bill. Then she met Vincent Draper. Vincent owned an insurance brokerage his own father had built, Draper and Combs, and he sat on the town council, and he had a house on the family-named side of the river with a portico and a lawn service that came on Thursdays whether it had rained or not. He married my mother 18 months after my father's funeral, in a wedding where I was the only person under 50, in a dress my mother had let me pick out myself, which I understood even then to be a kind of apology for everything that was about to change. I was 11. I remember watching her dance with him and thinking I had never once seen my mother's shoulders come down that far from her ears in 2 full years. Vincent hadn't just married my mother. He had rescued her from something, publicly, with witnesses, and she had spent 20 years since being grateful for that rescue in a way that looked, from the outside, a great deal like fear. I kept my father's name. It was the one thing I asked for, sitting at that same kitchen table 3 weeks before the wedding, and Vincent, to his credit, never pushed back on it. He raised me well in every way that shows up in a photograph, paid for my nursing degree without complaint, stood up at my wedding and gave a toast that made 2 tables laugh, sent a card every single year on the anniversary of my father's death, that never once, in 20 cards, mentioned my father by name. What he never did, not once in 20 years, was let me forget whose house I was standing in. He had a way of mentioning, lightly, at exactly the moments it would land hardest, how much a particular thing had cost, or how fortunate I was to have people willing to help. He never once raised his voice doing it. Vincent Draper has never needed volume. He has a ledger instead, and he reads from it in the gentlest tone imaginable. I married Julian Marsh when I was 26. He pulled my car over on Route 9 the winter before that. Not for anything, just because I was stopped on the shoulder with a dead battery and hazards blinking uselessly into the sleet, and he was off duty, driving home from a shift at Engine 4 in his own truck, and he stopped anyway. He got the car running in 11 minutes and refused to let me pay him for the jumper cables. 3 weeks later, I found him behind the counter at the hardware store, buying the exact same set for himself, having apparently given his away to a stranger on the side of the road without a second thought. And I understood something about him standing in that aisle that took most people years to learn. Julian Marsh was kind in a way that had nothing to do with who was watching. I liked him before I liked anything about him that would have shown up on paper. When our son Sawyer was born with a small hole between the two sides of his heart, it was Julian who sat up with me the whole night before the repair surgery, in a chair too small for him, tracing slow circles on the hospital blanket with one finger, telling me, not promising, telling me, the way he told people things at fires, flat and certain, that Sawyer was going to be fine, because he had already decided he wasn't going to consider the alternative a real possibility. He was right. He was usually right about the things he refused to consider. It is, to this day, one of the only kinds of stubbornness I have ever fully trusted. Julian died 3 years ago. A support beam, a house fire on Delacroix Street, a call that went wrong in the 4 seconds it takes a ceiling to decide it's had enough of holding itself up. Sawyer was 2. He doesn't remember his father's voice, which is a sentence I have said out loud exactly once, to my grandmother, on the anniversary 2 years ago, and never again, because saying it costs something I don't like paying twice. What I remember most from that week isn't the funeral, which I mostly experienced from somewhere outside my own body. It's Pearl, my grandmother, arriving at my apartment before I'd even called her, already knowing, the way people in Fairhaven's old fire department families always seem to know before the official call comes, and simply starting the dishwasher, and folding laundry, and not asking me to talk until I was ready to, which took 11 days. My grandmother, Pearl Whitfield, was a NICU nurse for 31 years before I was born, and when I graduated nursing school, she pinned a small brass fob watch to my scrubs with hands that had done the same thing to her own uniform decades earlier. Time means something different once you're the one counting somebody else's breaths, she told me. Ring twice if it's really bad. I've worn it every shift since. After Julian died, I clipped his fire department collar pin to the same clasp, and now the two of them ride together above my badge, ticking through every 12-hour shift like they're keeping time on purpose, for him and for every family in that unit who's counting the same way I once counted. What was actually at risk, that Sunday at the pot roast table, was never really a schedule. It was Sawyer, 5 years old that spring, heart repaired and stable, and monitored twice a year, a boy who still asked, some nights, whether hearts could get lonely for people they never got to meet, and whether his dad's heart had been a brave one or just a regular one that got unlucky. It was my license, if a formal finding ever touched my name, and it was the only version of a mother I had left, sitting 3 feet from a man who wrote her checks, and, I was only just beginning to understand, had never once stopped keeping a ledger of what those checks were owed. Most weeks, none of that mattered, because most weeks I was at Fairhaven General, and Fairhaven General was the one place I never had to perform being calm, because there it wasn't a performance. 3 nights before that dinner, a 9-month-old came in post-cardiac surgery, with his numbers sliding sideways at 2 in the morning, his mother pressed flat against the observation window with both hands, silent, in the specific way people go silent when they've decided screaming won't help, and they need every ounce of themselves for whatever comes next. I ran that bedside the way I run every bedside, quiet voice, short sentences, one task at a time, the parents watching my hands instead of my face, because my hands are the ones that tell the truth. We had him stable by 3:15. I charted it, handed off at 7, picked Sawyer up from Pearl's by 7:40, with just enough time to braid nothing because his hair's too short, and made it to Vincent and Sharon's table by 6, that Sunday evening, on maybe 5 hours of sleep across the last 29. Nobody at that table asked how the shift had gone. Vincent asked instead, setting down his fork with the particular precision of a man about to make a point, whether I'd given any more thought to Sawyer's routine. It was the first time he'd used that exact phrase. I didn't know yet to be afraid of it. I don't think there's much to think about, I told him. He's happy. He's healthy. He's exactly where he's supposed to be. Nobody's saying he isn't happy, Vincent said, in the tone he uses for zoning variances, and this, apparently, we're saying a boy at his age benefits from knowing what tomorrow looks like before he wakes up in it. Sharon studied her plate. She has always been very good at studying her plate. 3 days after that dinner, my phone buzzed with a text in the family group chat, the one Vincent had created years earlier and named, without any apparent irony, the Drapers. Let's find an evening to sit down properly and talk through Sawyer's routine. It read, "For his sake." Sharon reacted with a heart. I stared at that small red heart for a long time before I understood it wasn't agreement. It was surrender, dressed up small enough to fit on a phone screen. I said yes to the sit-down because saying no to Vincent had never once, in 20 years, ended a conversation. It had only ever postponed it to a place where I had less warning. We met at their house the following Thursday, in the formal living room they never used for anything else, on the good furniture, with a pitcher of iced tea Sharon had made, and nobody drank. Vincent laid it out, the way he laid out every insurance claim he'd ever denied, reasonably, patiently, with numbered points, counting them off on his own fingers, like it made the arithmetic more honest. Point 1. My rotating shifts meant Sawyer's bedtime moved 4 different ways across any given week. Point 2. People had started asking, at church, at the club, whether it wasn't hard on a boy, all that inconsistency, so soon after losing his father. I asked, evenly, who exactly had been asking. He said it didn't matter who. I said it mattered to me. Point 3. Delivered with the particular gentleness Vincent reserved for the things he wanted least argued with. Perhaps Sawyer would benefit from spending more structured time at their house. Regular nights. A real routine. Just until things settle, he said, though nothing in his voice suggested he believed anything was ever going to unsettle again. Only that the phrase sounded reasonable, and reasonable was the only register Vincent has ever needed. That's not going to happen tonight, I told him. It's a complete sentence, that one. It doesn't invite negotiation the way a longer answer does. He said I was being defensive, which is a thing men like Vincent say when a woman declines to be managed. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it's the part of this story I understand least kindly about myself, looking back. I didn't push back the way I should have. I was tired, and I was outnumbered at that table in every way that counted, and some old reflex in me, the 11-year-old watching her mother's shoulders finally come down at a wedding, still wanted, more than I wanted to admit even to myself, for Vincent Draper to think well of me. So instead of saying no and meaning it, I offered a compromise nobody had asked me for. I told them Sawyer could stay with them the coming weekend, unsupervised, 2 full nights, so they could see for themselves there was nothing to worry about. Sharon looked almost startled by the offer, her eyes flicking to me for the first time all evening. Vincent didn't look startled at all. Vincent simply nodded, once, like a man accepting delivery of something he'd already ordered and was only now confirming had arrived on schedule. I drove home that night, rehearsing all the ways it was a reasonable thing to have offered, and none of the rehearsing made the knot in my stomach loosen. On my way out, I'd passed Vincent's home office, door cracked, lamp still burning though it was nearly 10. On the hall table outside, it sat a courier envelope, return address, a law office 2 towns over I didn't recognize. Vincent's name typed clean across the front. I noticed it. I told myself it was probably council business, a zoning appeal, something entirely unrelated to my son. I didn't ask about it. That's the kind of detail you only understand you should have asked about once it's much too late to ask casually. The weekend came. I dropped Sawyer off Friday with his stuffed dog and his inhaler, though he hadn't needed the inhaler in over a year, and a folded note about his Sunday night bath routine that Sharon accepted without reading, tucking it straight into her cardigan pocket. I spent that Friday night wide awake for reasons I couldn't fully name, checking my phone every 40 minutes for a text that never came. And Saturday, I nearly called 4 separate times and made myself stop each time with my thumb already hovering over the screen, because calling would have proven Vincent's point instead of mine. Pearl came over both nights so I wouldn't be alone with it, and we sat up late doing a jigsaw puzzle of a lighthouse neither of us cared about finishing, mostly just to keep our hands moving. "You did the generous thing," she told me once, not quite looking up from the puzzle. Generous isn't always the same as safe. Those two get confused with each other more than people like to admit. Sawyer up Sunday afternoon. He was fine, sunburned on one cheek, full of a story about a neighbor's dog that could apparently almost talk. Entirely, ordinarily fine. It was in the car, 3 blocks from their house, that he asked me, out of nowhere, in the flat, unbothered voice small children use for questions that would flatten an adult. "Grandpa Vincent asked where you go at night when I'm asleep." I told him, "You're at the hospital fixing kids' hearts. Is that right?" I told him that was exactly right, and I meant it as steadily as I've ever meant anything, and I spent the rest of that drive with my hands very still on the wheel, because I had just understood, 3 blocks too late, that the unsupervised weekend I'd offered as a gesture of good faith had actually been an interview. I simply hadn't been in the room for it. The certified letter arrived that Thursday. I remember the exact moment because I signed for it standing in the hallway of my own building, in scrubs I hadn't yet changed out of, and the postal worker had to point twice at the name before I understood the envelope was addressed to my son, and his name was spelled wrong. Sawyer, with an extra I, a small clean error that told me, more than anything else in the document, that whoever had typed it had never once said my son's name out loud with any tenderness attached to it. Inside was an emergency ex parte petition, filed in county family court, requesting temporary guardianship of my minor child, citing an irregular and unstable caregiving schedule, and concerns raised by close family members regarding the minor's welfare. Vincent's name was on it as petitioner. My mother's was there too, beneath his, as a supporting affidavit, in a signature I recognized instantly because I'd watched her practice that exact loop on birthday cards my whole childhood. I read it standing in that hallway, with my keys still in my other hand, and I want to tell you I felt something enormous. I didn't, not yet. I felt the same flat, procedural quiet I feel at 4 in the morning when a monitor starts alarming, and my whole body simply goes to work before my mind has finished being afraid. I refolded the letter along its own crease, walked inside, put Sawyer's dinner on the table, helped him with a puzzle, read him 2 books, and did not let a single thing in my face change until he was asleep. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and called my grandmother, and it was somewhere in the middle of trying to explain the words emergency and guardianship in the same sentence that my voice finally did what it had been refusing to do all evening. Pearl let me get it all the way out before she said anything. Then she asked one question that didn't seem to connect to anything I'd just told her. "Iris, the drawer. Did you ever call that lawyer back? The one from after Julian?" I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, working backward through 2 years of grief I'd mostly managed by not examining it too closely, until I found the memory she meant. 6 weeks after Julian's funeral, a benefits liaison from the fire department had connected me with an estate attorney named Powell Aldrich to sort out survivor paperwork, pension elections, a small life insurance policy, the ordinary machinery of what happens administratively when a firefighter dies in the line of duty. There had been a second meeting on the calendar that I'd canceled and never rescheduled, because I remember standing in my kitchen that week, unable to look at one more form with Julian's full legal name printed at the top of it in a stranger's font. I told Pearl I never went back. She was quiet for a second, the kind of quiet she uses when she's deciding how much to say. "I think you should call his office tomorrow," she said. "Ask for Mr. Aldrich specifically. Tell him it's about Sawyer." I want to be honest that I almost didn't call. I told myself I'd deal with it once the panic settled, the way I'd been telling myself I'd deal with a lot of things for 2 years. But I called the next morning from the break room at Fairhaven General. Between patients, my badge and the 2 little pins on it catching the fluorescent light, and the woman who answered didn't sound surprised at all to hear from me. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "Mr. Aldrich has actually been expecting this call eventually. Can you come in Thursday?" I sat through my whole shift that day, with that sentence turning over in my mind, unable to understand what it meant for a stranger to have been expecting me. Powell Aldrich's office smelled like old paper and coffee that had been reheated once too often, and he was gentler than I'd expected a man who'd known my husband only through paperwork to be. He pulled a file with Julian's name on the tab and slid a document across the desk before I'd finished sitting down. It was called a Successor Guardian Designation and Testamentary Trust Amendment, filed and recorded with the county probate court 11 months before Vincent ever said the word custody at a dinner table. Julian had signed it the same week he joined Engine 4's technical rescue team, hazardous duty work, the kind that makes a young father start thinking in worst cases he'd rather never say out loud to his wife. It named me sole successor guardian of Sawyer and sole trustee of a small survivor trust, and it contained a clause I read 3 times before I understood what it actually did. No modification, challenge, or competing petition regarding guardianship could even be filed without 2 independent, court-ordered fitness evaluations completed first, both naming the same guardian as unfit, filed jointly, no exceptions, no shortcuts. "In plain terms," Aldrich said, watching my face the way you watch someone reading a diagnosis, "your husband made it structurally impossible for anyone to fast-track you out of your son's life. Whoever filed that ex parte petition either didn't know this existed or is hoping a judge signs off before anyone checks the county records closely enough to find it." I asked him, once I trusted my voice again, whose idea the clause had originally been. He glanced at a note clipped inside the folder. "Your grandmother called this office the week after the funeral," he said, "before you were anywhere near ready to think about paperwork of any kind. She wanted to make certain this part, specifically, was handled properly, and she was very particular about the evaluation language." He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask that day, though I understood, sitting there, that Pearl had a story of her own about a daughter-in-law once nearly pushed out of a family by people who thought they knew better than a grieving young mother, a story I only heard the fuller version of much later, on a Tuesday, over tea, about a sister-in-law of Pearl's own who'd lost her husband in a mill accident decades ago and lost her son's trust to in-laws not long after, simply for lack of a single signed page, and that Pearl had spent 2 years quietly making certain it would never happen twice in her own family. I left that office with a certified copy in a folder and a feeling I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not yet. Grief, mostly. Julian had done this for us without me ever fully knowing, in the middle of the ordinary, unremarkable business of being a new father who refused to consider the worst, and I had spent 2 years missing him without knowing he was still, in this one specific and enormous way, standing between our son and anyone who might come for him. Stay with me. The folder that ends this whole thing is already sitting in a drawer 40 minutes away, and the man who filed against my son has no idea it exists yet. Subscribe now so you don't miss the night he finds out. I didn't sit back and let the trust do all the work alone, though. A sealed document is only as good as the lawyer who knows how to use it at the right moment, and Powell Aldrich did wills and trusts, not custody litigation. He referred me to a family law attorney named Marisol Fung, a compact, unhurried woman who read the ex parte petition twice, out loud, in her office, before she said a single word about strategy. "This isn't really about a schedule," she said, tapping the page with one finger. "Nobody files an emergency petition over bedtime consistency. Emergency filings are for danger. This reads like danger because someone needed it to read that way fast, before anyone had time to ask why it was really being filed. Marisol pulled my shift logs going back 2 years, every swap, every covered hour, cross-referenced against the sign-in sheets at Pearl's, where Sawyer spent every single one of my night shifts, without exception, in a routine so consistent that Pearl herself, without being asked, produced a small spiral notebook from her kitchen drawer where she'd been quietly logging every overnight for 3 years, dates and times in careful handwriting. "Not because I doubted you," Pearl said, a little embarrassed, sliding it across my table. "Habit. Old NICU habit. You document the thing you love in case anyone ever asks you to prove it." It was Sharon who showed up at my apartment 2 days later, alone, unannounced, standing on my welcome mat in a coat that still had the dry cleaner's tag pinned to the collar, like she'd left the house too fast to notice. She didn't apologize. My mother has never once, in my whole life, apologized in a way that used the actual word. But she sat down at my kitchen table, in the chair Julian used to sit in, and told me something closer to true than anything she'd said to me in 20 years. "My own mother," she said, turning her mug slowly without drinking from it, "lost the house after my father left. Nobody helped her. She asked her own brothers for a loan, once, and they made her sit through a lecture about responsibility before they'd even consider it, and then they said no anyway. I was 13. I watched her go gray in about a year. She looked up at me then, the first time all evening. You don't know what it's like to almost lose everything, and then have someone hand it all back to you with conditions attached. You spend the rest of your life terrified of the conditions changing, and you do whatever keeps them from changing, even when part of you knows exactly how that looks from the outside." I told her I understood more of that fear than she probably thought I did. I have my own version of it, at 4 in the morning, watching a monitor. She almost smiled at that, the first real thing to cross her face in longer than I could remember. Then, softening further, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, she added that Vincent had been under a lot of pressure lately, with the wing project, and caught herself half a second too late, the way people do when they've handed over a true thing they didn't mean to. I didn't know yet what the wing project was. I knew, within a week, exactly how much it mattered. The children's wing at Fairhaven General, the same wing where surgeons had repaired my infant son's heart, the same wing whose donor wall I walked past on every single shift, my own hospital ID badge scanning me through doors 12 feet from Julian and Sawyer's own names, etched into a much smaller plaque near the family lounge, was mid-construction on a major expansion, and Draper and Combs held the commercial insurance bond on the general contractor. A local business journal item, 3 paragraphs long, mentioned a code compliance dispute that had ballooned the project's liability exposure well past what anyone had originally budgeted for. Marisol's paralegal, at an unrelated council mixer, fell into conversation with one of Vincent's fellow councilmen, who mentioned, casually, the way people mention things they don't realize are dangerous to repeat, that Vincent had been asking around about trust disbursement timelines for minors, which is an oddly specific question for a man who claims his only concern is a 5-year-old's bedtime. Marisol laid it out plainly, the way she laid out everything, spreading 3 documents across her desk like a hand of cards. Guardianship, even shared or supervised, would give Vincent standing to petition for co-signature authority over disbursements from Sawyer's Trust for the minor's needs, medical, educational, whatever a sympathetic judge might approve without digging too deep. It wouldn't hand him the money outright, it would hand him access and a story to tell about why he needed it, and Vincent had spent 30 years being extremely good at stories. 2 weeks later, an engraved invitation arrived at my apartment, along with the standard mailer sent to every Fairhaven General staff member. This year's Children's Wing Legacy Gala would honor, as community champion, city councilman, and longtime hospital donor, Vincent Draper. I set the invitation on my counter next to a folder with a sealed guardianship designation in it, and understood, looking at both at once, exactly what kind of night I was going to have to build. Concern that comes with paperwork attached was never concern. I understood that clearly for the first time standing in my kitchen that evening, Sawyer's cereal bowl still in the sink behind me. It was a claim being filed, wearing a gentler word than the one it deserved. I ran one small test of my own before I did anything else, the kind of thing I'm not entirely proud of, but don't regret either. Vincent had scheduled another stability check dinner, and I showed up 20 minutes late on purpose, having timed it deliberately after a shift that had actually ended exactly on time. I wanted to see, once and without an audience of concerned relatives to perform for, what he actually cared about. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask about Sawyer, waiting at Pearl's with his puzzle half finished. He asked, tight around the mouth, whether I had any idea how it looked, a mother who couldn't manage to be on time for her own son's future. I apologized for the lateness and said nothing else, and drove home already certain of something Marisol would spend the next month proving on paper. His yardstick had never once, not for a single day, been Sawyer's welfare. It had only ever been how things looked from the outside, and whether he remained the one deciding how they looked. 3 nights after that dinner, Fairhaven General's PICU took a 9-month-old post-op patient crashing fast, blood pressure sliding, parents pressed against the window in the particular silence of people who don't yet know if they're about to lose someone. I ran that bed the way I run every bed, quiet voice, short sentences, one task at a time, and we brought him back within 11 minutes. Dr. Abernathy, the unit's medical director, stood in the doorway afterward longer than he needed to, watching me chart with hands that had gone perfectly steady the second the crisis started, and said, in the understated way he says everything, that he'd put me up against anyone in the state. I didn't know a woman named Corinne Aldous was standing 3 feet behind him, there for an unrelated case review, watching the whole thing over his shoulder. Corinne was the court-appointed guardian ad litem, assigned to evaluate the guardianship petition, the person whose recommendation, more than almost anyone else's, the judge would actually weigh. She introduced herself the next morning, brisk and unreadable, in the particular way of someone who has learned not to tip her hand before her report is finished, and asked whether she could interview me at the hospital instead of at home. I'd like to see how you actually work, she said, not just how you talk about working. We sat in the small family consultation room off the unit, and Corinne asked exactly 9 questions, in a flat, careful order, none of them about bedtime. She asked who covered Sawyer during night shifts, and for how long that arrangement had held. She asked whether Sawyer had ever missed a cardiology follow-up, and I handed her the binder where I track every one, dated back 3 years, not a single gap. She asked whether anyone had raised concerns about my parenting prior to the petition, and I told her, honestly, no one ever had. Not once. Not until a certified letter with my son's name spelled wrong arrived out of nowhere. She asked, last, whether I thought my stepfather's petition had anything to do with money, and I told her I didn't know for certain, only that I thought it was worth someone besides me asking that question out loud, on the record. Farah, my closest friend on the unit, covered my patients the entire 40 minutes so I wouldn't have to split my attention, and afterward, walked Corinne past the nurse's station herself, unprompted, so she could see the schedule board with my name on it in the same steady rotation it had held for 2 straight years. If you've ever had to prove to someone that you were a good parent when you shouldn't have had to prove anything at all, drop a comment below and tell me. We're almost to the night this finally settles. Before she left, almost as an afterthought, Corinne mentioned she'd be at the Legacy Gala herself that Friday. Her niece was one of the year's scholarship recipients. I didn't say anything about the folder in my kitchen. I only said I'd see her there. Marisol wanted to resolve everything quietly beforehand, filing our response and the sealed designation through the ordinary court channel days ahead of the hearing, letting the paperwork do its work in an office nobody would ever picture when they thought of our family. It was the safer plan, and she was right that it was safer, and I told her no. I'm not hiding this in a filing cabinet so it can get whispered about at church for the next 10 years. 1/2 of the story at a time, I told her. It happens where he decided to stand up in public and call himself a protector of children. That's not cruelty, that's just correct. Marisol looked at me for a long moment, The way people look at you when they've just revised their opinion of how much handling you actually need, and agreed to be there Friday with the folder closed until I said otherwise. Sawyer wanted to wear his toy stethoscope to the gala, looped over his small collared shirt, like Mommy, and I let him, not yet understanding how much that particular detail was going to matter to me later, watching it from across a ballroom. Pearl came by that evening to help me dress, and as I stood in front of the mirror in a gown I'd bought 8 months earlier for a friend's wedding I'd since had to skip for a double shift, she pinned the fob watch and Julian's collar pin to the strap of my clutch instead of my scrubs, for once, and said only, "For luck. Though I don't think you'll need much of it tonight. You've been building this since before you knew you were building anything." The Fairhaven Children's Wing Legacy Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Ashwell Hotel, with round tables, a string quartet, and a 2-story banner, reading Community Champion, Vincent Draper, above a podium wreathed in white hydrangeas. Sharon sat at the head table in a navy dress she'd worn to my own wedding, not quite meeting my eyes as I found my seat with Marisol 2 tables back, close enough to see, far enough not to be seated among the family. Corinne stood near the rear of the room with a glass of sparkling water she never finished, watching everything the way guardian ad litems are trained to watch a room. I held Sawyer's hand through the appetizer course and let him show 3 separate strangers his stethoscope, listening gravely to each of their hearts in turn, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, something almost like stillness. Vincent's speech ran 12 minutes, and it was, I'll admit, a genuinely good speech. Warm, specific, funny in 2 places, building toward a story about the wing's first patient, a girl who'd since grown up and sent him a letter he read aloud, his voice catching in a way I believe, even now, was not entirely performance. He closed on a line about how every child in this town deserves to know someone is standing between them and whatever tries to knock them down. The room applauded for a long time. I applauded too. I meant part of it. Somewhere underneath the calm I'd been holding for weeks, some old 11-year-old piece of me still wanted, even then, for it to be true. Then the applause folded into the toast, waiters circulating with champagne, and I stood, and Marisol stood beside me, and we crossed the room together while the string quartet was still finding its next piece. We didn't shout. We didn't need to. I asked, quietly, for 2 minutes before anyone reached for their glass, and something in my voice, flat, procedural, the exact voice I use at 4 in the morning when a monitor starts alarming, made the small cluster near the podium go still without me raising it even once. "I'm not here to make a scene," I told him, and I watched him relax by exactly 1 degree, the way people do when they think the worst has already passed. "I'm here because you filed something 2 months ago that I need you to understand isn't going anywhere the way you think it is." Marisol didn't hand the folder to Vincent. She handed it to Corinne, who was already stepping forward from the back of the room, because a guardian ad litem walking a document across a ballroom carries a kind of weight no lawyer's hand ever could. Corinne opened it, read the operative clause aloud in a clear, unhurried voice to the small circle now watching. 2 council members, the hospital board chair, my mother, the words, sole successor guardian. No modification without 2 independent evaluations, landing one at a time, like something being laid down rather than thrown. She said, simply, that the petition before the court could not lawfully proceed given a properly filed, pre-existing guardianship designation, and that she would be filing her recommendation for dismissal that week. I watched the color leave Vincent's face the way I've watched color leave 100 faces on 100 worse nights. Except this time, nobody's heart was actually in danger, only his account of himself. His hand found the edge of the podium. "I was only trying to protect that boy," he said, too loud for the room, the first crack in 30 years of careful volume, and it was his voice that broke the calm, not mine. I said maybe 6 words in that whole conversation. I let the document do what documents are for. "You were trying to protect the wing loan," Marisol said quietly, not unkindly, more as a fact laid on a table than an accusation thrown across one. Vincent didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Two of his fellow council members were already exchanging a look I recognized from 100 family rooms. The look of people quietly subtracting a story from what they've actually just watched with their own eyes. My mother stepped half out of the circle, close enough that only I could hear her. "I knew about the insurance bond," she said, quiet, quick, like she needed the sentence out before she lost her nerve for it. "About the wing project. Before tonight." I didn't say anything because I was scared of what happens to me if his name stops being good in this town. I didn't forgive her standing there, and I told her so, gently. "I believe you," I said. "That doesn't undo it, but I believe you." It was the truest thing either of us had said to the other in 20 years. Vincent tried once more, a line about appearances, about how none of this looked the way it actually was, his voice pitching up toward the register he uses for people he thinks he can still out-argue. And then, watching two of his own council colleagues quietly step back from the circle, watching the room's attention tilt away from his banner and toward the folder in Corinne's hands, he simply stopped. Not an apology, just a stopping, the sound a man makes when he finally understands the room has already reached its own verdict without waiting for his closing argument. In the weeks after the gala, Vincent quietly withdrew his name from that fall's council race, citing family priorities in a 2-line statement nobody in Fairhaven fully believed. Word moved through town the way it always does, through the hospital auxiliary and the Rotary breakfast and the line at the Good Bakery. That Draper & Combs was being restructured, its book of business sold off in pieces to a firm 2 counties over. Corinne's report closed the guardianship case within 3 weeks, recommending dismissal with prejudice, a sentence I read 4 times before I let myself believe it was really over. My mother started calling on Sundays, tentative at first, a 5-minute call about nothing in particular, then steadier, earning her way back one ordinary phone call at a time, instead of one dramatic gesture, which is the only way I'd have believed her anyway. She has met Sawyer twice since, both times on my terms, both times leaving, before anything could tip back into what it used to be. We are not what we were before Vincent, and I don't know if we ever will be, and I've stopped needing to know on any particular schedule. Sawyer still wears the stethoscope to the grocery store now, not for anyone's benefit, just because he likes it, listening gravely to the melons for reasons known only to him. Some Tuesday nights Pearl still comes by with a pot roast of her own, made properly, the way she says it should always have been made, and we eat it at my small kitchen table with 3 mismatched chairs and no one keeping score of who owes what to whom. I wear the fob watch and Julian's collar pin on every shift, the 2 of them ticking together above my badge through nights when I'm holding someone else's child while a monitor teaches their heart how to keep time, and some part of me has started, quietly, without telling anyone, keeping a folder of my own, a lawyer's name, a guardian ad litem's number, a short list of what to ask for first, for the other frightened parents on my unit who call me at odd hours asking how a person even begins to fight for their own child. I don't advertise it, it's just there, in a drawer, for whoever needs it next. Protection that comes with paperwork filed against you was never protection. I understand that as clearly now as I understand anything I've ever charted at 4 in the morning. It was only ever a claim being made on your life, wearing a gentler word than the one it deserved. That's my story. A misspelled name on an envelope, a folder my husband left behind without me knowing, and a room full of people who came to watch a man call himself a protector, and stayed to watch him learn what the word actually costs. If someone in your life has ever confused controlling you with taking care of you, take this as your sign that you're allowed to tell the difference out loud, starting today, calmly, in your own time. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.